You have seen it. A freight train, 100 cars long, sitting dead still on a mainline track somewhere between two towns you have never heard of. No crew walking the ballast, no switching, no movement at all. Just steel and silence for hours. It happens thousands of times a day across the North American rail network, and most people assume something is broken. Sometimes it is, but more often, that train is stopped for reasons that have nothing to do with mechanical failure and everything to do with how the railroad industry actually operates. Number 9 on this list can shut down a main line for half a day with a single broken piece of steel. Number 4 is the reason a train crew can legally refuse to touch the controls. And what sits at number 1 is the corporate strategy that made every one of these stops longer. Here are 15 reasons why freight trains stop in the middle of nowhere for hours. Number 15. Brake testing after a set-out or pickup. Every time a freight train adds or removes cars at an intermediate point, federal regulations require a brake test before the train can move again. The process is not quick. A carman or qualified crew member walks the length of the train, checking that AIR is flowing through the brake pipe to every car. On a train stretching over a mile, that walk alone can take 30 minutes or more. If a brake valve fails the test, the car has to be isolated or set out entirely, which means more paperwork, more walking, and more time standing still. The Federal Railroad Administration does not allow shortcuts on this. A train that moves without a verified brake system is a runaway waiting to happen, and the railroads learned that lesson the hard way over a century of catastrophic derailments. So the train sits. The crossing stays blocked, and the only thing moving is a single person in a high-visibility vest, walking slowly along the rail. Number 14. Defect detector alerts. Wayside detectors are spaced along mainline track every 20 to 40 miles across the network. They scan passing trains for overheated bearings, dragging equipment, shifted loads, and wheels that have gone out of round. When a detector flags a defect, the crew gets a radio alert and is required to stop and inspect. Sometimes the defect is real. A journal bearing running hot can seize and derail a car within miles. But sometimes the detector is triggered by residual heat from heavy braking or a sensor calibration issue, and the crew still has to stop, walk back to the flagged car, and verify with their own eyes. On a train with 150 cars, that verification can take an hour, particularly if the flagged axle is buried deep in the consist. The train does not move until the crew confirms it is safe or sets the car out entirely. Number 13. Waiting to meet an opposing train on single track. Most people assume that American railroads are double-tracked, with one line for each direction. They are not. The large majority of mainline rail in the United States is single-track. Two trains heading toward each other on the same line cannot pass unless one of them pulls into a siding, a short parallel section of track with switches at both ends, and waits for the other to go by. This is called a meet. It sounds simple. It is not. The dispatcher, sitting in a control center that may be hundreds of miles away, decides which train takes the siding based on priority. Unit trains carrying coal or intermodal containers for a major shipper often get the green light over manifest freight. The lower priority train pulls into the siding, and the crew waits. Sometimes the opposing train is on time, and the wait is 10 or 15 minutes. Sometimes it is not, and the wait stretches to hours. The problem compounds when sidings are too short. Modern freight trains routinely exceed 10,000 feet in length. Many sidings on the American network were built decades ago for trains half that size. A train too long for the siding cannot fit, which means the dispatcher has to reroute one of the two trains or find a longer siding further down the line. While that gets sorted out, both trains stop. In busy corridors, a single delayed meet can cascade through the entire subdivision, creating a chain of stopped trains stretching across 100 miles of territory. This is the daily reality of single-track railroading. It works when traffic is light and trains run on schedule. When volumes increase or schedules slip, the whole network begins to seize, and the result is a freight train sitting motionless on a stretch of track with nothing around it but open ground and a grade crossing that will not clear for another hour. Pause 1 second. Number 12. Signal failures. Railroad signals govern the movement of trains the way traffic lights govern cars, except there are no alternate routes. When a signal goes dark or displays a restricting aspect that the crew cannot verify, the train stops. Federal rules require the crew to contact the dispatcher, who then has to determine whether the failure is a true signal malfunction, a track circuit issue caused by a broken rail, a wiring fault, or even flooding across the trackbed. Until the cause is confirmed, the train cannot proceed at normal speed. In some cases, the crew is authorized to pass the signal at restricted speed, which means crawling along at roughly 15 miles per hour, prepared to stop at any moment. On a 100-mile stretch of territory, that can turn a 2-hour run into an all-day crawl. Signal systems on many lines still rely on track circuits that were engineered decades ago. A broken rail interrupts the circuit the same way a wiring fault does, and the crew has no way to distinguish between a minor electrical glitch and a gap in the steel beneath them. So they treat every failure as real until proven otherwise. The cost of guessing wrong is a derailment. Pause for 1 second. Here is the part that rarely gets discussed. American railroads haul the majority of the nation's long-distance freight, more ton-miles over distance than trucks or barges for shipments moving hundreds of miles or more. And they do it on a network that is, for the most part, a single-lane road. The major railroads own and maintain their own track, and they make capital decisions based on return on investment, not public convenience. Adding a second main track costs millions per mile. Building new sidings costs millions more. So the infrastructure stays lean, and the system works right up until it does not. Every reason on this list is made worse by the fact that there is almost no slack in the network. A train that stops for any cause does not just delay itself. It blocks the track for everything behind it and everything coming toward it. The railroad is a system of bottlenecks, and when one piece stops, the entire system feels it for hours. Number 11. Maintenance of way windows. Track needs maintenance. Rail gets replaced, ties get swapped, ballast gets tamped and resurfaced, and none of it can happen while trains are running over the work zone. Railroads schedule maintenance windows, blocks of time when a section of track is taken out of service for work crews. Any train approaching that section during the window has to stop and hold until the work is complete and the track is returned to service. These windows are planned in advance, but the work does not always finish on schedule. A surfacing gang that falls behind means the window extends, and every train stacked up behind the work zone sits longer. In remote territory, where the nearest town might be 30 miles away, these maintenance holds are invisible to everyone except the people sitting at a blocked crossing. And when multiple gangs are working the same subdivision, the windows can stack, turning an entire afternoon into dead time for every train on the line. Number 10. The train is too long for the siding. This is a problem that has gotten steadily worse with every passing decade. Freight trains have grown dramatically in length. In the 1980s, a long train was 5,000 feet. Today, trains regularly exceed 10,000 feet, and some push past 15,000. But the sidings along the network have not kept pace. Thousands of sidings across the country were built for trains that no longer exist. When a dispatcher needs to put a train into a siding for a meet or to clear the main for a priority movement, and the train does not fit, the options are limited. The dispatcher can try to find a longer siding further ahead. The dispatcher can hold the train in place until the opposing movement clears, or the dispatcher can authorize the crew to double over, pulling partway through, uncoupling, running the locomotives forward, and then backing the rear portion in. That last option can take hours by itself. Number 9. Broken knuckle. A knuckle is the casting at the end of each car's coupler that interlocks with the knuckle on the next car. It is the handshake that holds the train together. Knuckles are designed to be the sacrificial part of the coupling system, the piece that breaks before something more expensive does. And they break often. A heavy train pulling upgrade, a slack run-in on a downhill stretch, a cold night that makes the steel brittle. When a knuckle breaks, the train comes apart, the air brake line separates, and the entire train goes into emergency braking. Everything stops. The crew then has to figure out where the break happened. On a train that stretches over 2 miles, that means walking that consist in whatever weather and whatever terrain the railroad runs through until they find the separated cars. If they are carrying a spare knuckle, and most locomotives carry at least one, they can make the repair on the spot. But changing a knuckle is not a quick job. The broken pieces have to be hammered out. The new knuckle has to be positioned and seated, the coupler pin has to be set, and then the cars have to be coupled back together. After that, the entire brake system has to be recharged and tested before the train can move again. If the crew does not have a spare, or if the coupler body itself is damaged beyond what a knuckle swap can fix, they call for mechanical assistance. A repair truck has to drive out to the location, which in remote territory can take hours. And the location is not always easy to reach. Railroad right-of-way does not always have road access. Sometimes the mechanic is walking half a mile down the track carrying tools and a knuckle casting that weighs roughly 60 pounds. All of this happens while the train sits motionless and every crossing it occupies stays blocked. A single knuckle failure in the wrong place can shut down a mainline corridor for half a day. Pause for 1 second. Number 8. Fueling at remote locations. Diesel locomotives carry enough fuel for hundreds of miles, but they do eventually run low. Fuel stops on the railroad are not like highway gas stations. They are fixed locations, often at yards or designated fueling pads, and not every route has them conveniently placed. When a train's lead locomotive is running low, the crew may have to stop at a fueling point that is nowhere near a town or a paved road. The fueling process takes time. Each locomotive holds several thousand gallons of diesel, and fueling trucks or fixed racks pump at a set rate. A 3-locomotive consist can take the better part of an hour to top off. The train is parked the entire time, and every crossing it sits on stays down. On some western routes, the distance between fueling points can stretch so far that a train running heavy or fighting headwinds burns through its reserves faster than planned, forcing an unscheduled stop at whichever fuel pad comes next. Number 7. Hazardous materials compliance. Trains carrying hazardous materials are subject to additional federal regulations that can force unscheduled stops. If a crew receives a report of a leaking car, or if a wayside detector flags a tank car with an anomaly, the train stops immediately. The crew locates the car, assesses the situation, and determines whether the load is genuinely compromised. Even if the leak turns out to be condensation or a minor valve seep that poses no danger, the regulations require documentation and, in some cases, a call to the railroad's hazmat response team before the train can proceed. If the car is genuinely leaking a regulated commodity, the response escalates quickly. Local emergency services get notified. The area around the train may be cordoned off. A hazmat crew has to reach the site, assess containment options, and either patch the leak or arrange for the car to be offloaded. The car has to be isolated or transferred before the train moves again. None of this is fast, and all of it happens wherever the train happened to be when the alarm was raised. There is a pattern running through all of these stops, and it is not about things breaking. It is the tension between a railroad that wants to move freight as cheaply as possible and a physical network that has hard limits on what it can absorb. Every stopped train represents a calculation someone already made. The railroad could build more sidings. It could hire more crews. It could run shorter trains that actually fit the existing infrastructure. It could invest in more robust signal systems and newer defect detectors that produce fewer false alarms. All of that costs money. The Class 1 railroads in the United States are publicly traded companies that answer to shareholders every quarter. A blocked crossing costs the railroad nothing. A new siding costs millions. So the trains keep getting longer, the crews keep getting leaner, and the stops keep getting more frequent. What the public experiences as a malfunction is, more often than not, the system working exactly as it was designed to work. Number 6. Terminal congestion. A freight train does not simply travel from one point to another. It travels from one terminal to another, and if the destination terminal is full, the train cannot enter. So it stops somewhere upstream and waits. Railroaders call this holding out, and it happens constantly across the network. Terminals get congested for all kinds of reasons. A surge in intermodal traffic overwhelms the available crane capacity. A labor shortage means fewer hostlers to move cars inside the yard. Severe weather slows loading and unloading operations. A derailment inside the terminal shuts down a lead track. Whatever the cause, the effect is the same. Trains line up on the main line, each one waiting its turn to enter a facility that was not built for the volume it now handles. In some corridors, trains held out of congested terminals can back up for dozens of miles, each one sitting on a section of track with its crossings blocked and its crew burning through their available hours. Pause for 1 second. Number 5. A dead locomotive in the consist. A modern freight train typically runs with 2 or 3 locomotives at the head end, and sometimes additional distributed power units placed through the train for added pulling force on heavy grades. When one of those units fails, the train loses a significant portion of its tractive effort. Depending on the terrain and the tonnage, the remaining locomotives may not have the power to keep the train moving, particularly on a grade. The crew shuts down the failed unit, reports the situation to the dispatcher, and waits for instructions. Sometimes the dispatcher authorizes the train to proceed at reduced speed on level track. But if the train is climbing or hauling a heavy load, it may need a rescue locomotive sent from the nearest terminal. That locomotive has to be dispatched, travel to the location under its own power, couple onto the disabled train, and then the air brake test has to happen all over again before anything moves. In winter, the problem gets worse. Cold temperatures thicken diesel fuel, drain batteries, and make electrical connections unreliable. A locomotive that was running fine at 60 degrees can refuse to start at 10 below. The crew sits in the remaining units, heat running, waiting for a replacement that may be hours away. The whole process can easily consume half a day. Number 4. Hours of service. Federal law limits how long a freight train crew can work. Under the Hours of Service Act, a crew is allowed 12 hours of on-duty time. When that clock runs out, the crew must stop working immediately, wherever they happen to be. It does not matter if the train is 5 miles from the terminal. It does not matter if the locomotive is sitting on a crossing in the middle of a small town. The law says, stop, and the crew stops. Railroaders have a phrase for this. They call it dying on the law. When a crew dies on the law, the train sits until a relief crew arrives. That relief crew has to travel from the nearest crew change point to wherever the train stopped, which can be on a remote stretch of track miles from the nearest paved road. The railroad dispatches a van, commonly known as a dog catch, to pick up the expired crew and deliver the fresh one. In theory, this should take a couple of hours. In practice, it routinely takes much longer. The relief crew may not be immediately available. The van driver may have multiple pickups and drop-offs to handle. Road access to the stopped train may require a long detour. The Hours of Service Act exists for a critical reason. Fatigued crews cause accidents, and the law was strengthened after several incidents where crew exhaustion was identified as a contributing factor. But the way the railroads manage crew scheduling often pushes crews right to the edge of their limit. A train that encounters any delay on its run, a long meet, a slow order through a maintenance zone, a stop for a defect detector, eats into the crew's available hours. By the time those delays stack up, the crew runs out of clock short of their destination. The result is a train parked in the middle of nowhere with a crew that is legally prohibited from touching the controls. The town whose crossing is blocked has no recourse. The railroad has no obligation to move the train until a qualified relief crew arrives and completes their own brake check. And that new crew starts their own 12-hour clock, which means if the delays continue, the whole cycle can repeat itself further down the line. Number 3. Crew shortages at change points. Even when a crew reaches their designated crew change point on time, there may be nobody waiting to take the train. Crew change points are locations where one crew hands the train off to another, spaced roughly every couple of 100 miles along a railroad's network. The system depends on fresh crews being available and ready. It falls apart when they are not. Railroads have cut their workforce significantly over the past 2 decades. Fewer employees means fewer available crews, which means longer waits at change points. A train that arrives with no relief crew ready sits on the main track until someone is called in from the extra board. That person may be at home, subject to a 2-hour call window before they report. By the time they are called, get to the terminal, receive their paperwork, and ride out to the train, 4 or 5 hours can pass. In smaller towns where the railroad closed the local crew base, the nearest available conductor might live an hour's drive from the reporting point. The train does not move for any of it. Number 2. Dispatcher holds. No freight train moves without authority from the dispatcher. The dispatcher controls the flow of traffic across an entire operating division, and the dispatcher's priority list is rigid. A unit grain train heading for an export terminal during harvest season gets the green light over a mixed manifest train every time. The manifest sits and waits. In congested territory, a low-priority train can be held at successive locations for hours, passed over by every priority movement on the subdivision. The crew cannot argue. The crew cannot proceed without authority. They sit in the locomotive cab watching priority trains roll past on the adjacent track. Or they sit in silence on a single-track main, waiting for a slot that may not open until the next shift's traffic pattern clears. Nobody is going to call and apologize. The crew does not know when they will move. They do not know what they are waiting for. They just know that somewhere in a dispatch center, their train is at the bottom of a screen full of higher priority movements. The train waits until the dispatcher decides it is time to move, and not a second before. Number 1. Precision scheduled railroading. The single biggest reason freight trains stop more often and sit longer today has a name. Precision scheduled railroading, or PSR, is an operating philosophy that swept through the North American railroad industry starting in the mid-2010s. The man most associated with it, Hunter Harrison, implemented versions of it at Illinois Central, Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, and finally CSX, where he arrived in 2017 and began cutting immediately. The core idea is elegant on paper: reduce costs by running fewer, longer trains on tighter schedules, cutting terminal dwell time, closing smaller yards, and shrinking the workforce. Move cars, not locomotives. Eliminate every minute of idle time that does not generate revenue. On a quarterly earnings call, it looks like efficiency. Operating ratios dropped. Stock prices climbed. Wall Street loved it. On the ground, it stripped the slack out of a system that depended on slack to function. Fewer crews mean more hours of service expirations in the field. Longer trains mean more knuckle failures, more siding conflicts, more time-consuming brake tests. Fewer active locomotives mean less margin when a unit goes down. Closed hump yards mean cars travel longer distances to get sorted, adding transit time even as the railroad claims faster service. And reduced capital spending on infrastructure means the network has fewer places for trains to get out of each other's way. Every single problem on this list existed before PSR arrived. But PSR made every one of them worse by systematically removing the buffers that used to absorb these inevitable delays. The Surface Transportation Board held hearings. Shippers testified about service collapses. Agricultural exporters missed vessel loadings because trains that used to arrive in 3 days were taking 7. The freight trains still stop. They just stop longer now, with fewer people available to get them moving again. Pause for 1 second. The next time you sit at a crossing watching a freight train that has not moved in an hour, know this. What you are looking at is not a broken train. It is a system running on the thinnest possible margin, where every delay compounds and every cost cut echoes down the line. The train will move when the math allows it, not a minute before. If you learned something from this one, hit subscribe. There is plenty more where this came from.